Hi everybody. In this video we're going to be talking about the main ideas in Caro Kann. Caro Kann is a very solid opening that black can play against d4. So if white plays e4, we are going to reply with c6, aiming for the d5 pawn break. Now after this position, white mainly moves the pawn to d4, controlling the full center. And as black, we're going to push d5. Now there are three main ideas. They can take the pawn, which is the exchange variation. They can push the pawn, which is the advanced variation. They can also move the knight to c3, which is the main line. There are some other variations too. For example, they can play f3, which is a fantasy variation. They can move the knight to d2, which is the modern variation. But let's go over the main line first. So if the opponent moves the knight to c3, they're defending the pawn. And in Caro Kann, the main idea is to get this light-squared bishop out very quickly. Like a lot of positions actually follow a similar pattern with the French defense. But let's go just back for 1 second now. In the French defense, white is actually moving the d pawn again. But instead of the, black is moving the d pawn again. Instead of the c pawn, we actually move the e pawn. And because of this, our light squared bishop cannot really get out. And a lot of times, black has difficulty moving the bishop out. So sometimes there are some ideas, like moving the bishop to somewhere like a6, or try to do a fianchetto from b7. But if we're playing Caro Kann, there's none of that. So our bishop is going to be able to get out first. So if the knight gets out to here, we still want to move the bishop to f5, but there's a pawn there. So in order to be able to move the bishop out, we're going to capture the pawn. And after they capture us, we move the bishop to f5, attacking the knight. When they move the knight to here, they're attacking our bishop, so we're going to tuck the bishop to g6, and we are preventing the knight from going to any of these squares. But this the opposite is true for the opponent's knight too. The opponent's knight is preventing our bishop from going to any of these squares too. Now in this position, if white wants, they can go for trapping the bishop, and in order to prevent this, we're going to play h6. You can also play h5, but if we play h5, this pawn is a little bit overextended, and white can try to attack this. So, and generally speaking, in the main line, we castle over the king side, so we want our pawn structure to be safer. Therefore, we move the pawn to h6, and if the opponent plays h5, kicking our bishop, we'll go to h7. They might move the knight, they're developing the knight, and generally speaking, the knight wants to go to e5, so to counter that, we can move our knight to d7. If they do bring it, we can capture it. There's nothing that concerns black right now. And after this, white might bring the bishop to do the exchange. Now, generally speaking, whenever there's a bishop exchange, you might be cool with it, like sticking in the back, but right now, if they are the one who captures our bishop, we have to move our rook, which will prevent us from castling in the future, and also we will be losing a tempo by moving the rook. So because of that, we want to actually capture the opponent's bishop instead. Now after they capture us back, we're going to complete the Caro pawn formation. We're attacking this d5 square, so it becomes very difficult for the opponent to move the pawn to d5. And then maybe they will move the bishop to d2. They can also go to f4 too. And now we're going to complete with the knight. They might castle queenside, and we're going to move the bishop to e7. You can also go to d6, but generally speaking, e7 is safer. Now, it kind of looks like black's pieces are all in the back. So in order to remedy this, we have a few options. In the Caro Kann, we want to move the queen along this diagonal. We can go to b6, and in some positions to a5. But obviously, because they have the bishop right now, we don't want to go to a5. We can also go to c7 too. This is one of the main ideas as well. So if the opponent brings a knight to here to do this next knight exchange, we can capture and then maneuver our knight here with tempo. And if they go back, we want to castle. And in the future, this is important. Black wants to open up white's pawn structure with c5. This is also a very common idea in the French defense too. So we want to move the rook to the c1 file, right? We want to move it to the c file to aim it at the opponent's king. And this is the main line. Like, in this position, if the opponent brings a knight to c3, we're playing now the main line. If they move the knight to d2, this actually turns into the same exact thing too. You can just capture. After they capture, we bring the bishop. Again, we want to bring out the bishop as soon as possible. And they usually don't want to go back to the same square or to d2 because that's just going to be costing a tempo move. So if knight goes somewhere like g3, they're just attacking our bishop. I want to go back to g6. And now if they play h4 again, h6 is the way to defend this bishop. And if they attack right away, we can go over here. And then they will move the knight. When the knight gets out, they're attacking the e5 square. So again, we want to counter that with knight d7. Now, if they bring the bishop to d3 to do the exchange first, well, then the d4 pawn is hanging. So the order of the moves is important. And if somebody is memorizing, there can be some mistakes like this. Alright, so if we play the pawn to d5, and then instead of moving knight to here, the opponent actually moves the pawn to e5. This is the advanced variation. They're advancing the pawn forward. And again, we want to get the bishop out as soon as possible, and we definitely don't want to go to e6. That's going to be blocking our pawn, which is going to be blocking the bishop. And we cannot go to g4 anyway, and we cannot go to h3, so we will be moving the bishop to f5. Now, if we play a bishop f5 and they bring their bishop to here, we actually want to capture the opponent's bishop. You can still go back, and if they capture, you want to capture with the h pawn, opening up the rook's file. This is also a solid option too, but generally speaking, we want to get rid of the bishop as soon as possible because it's going to cost us so much tempi moving it all around all the time. So if they go over here, you take it, they bring the queen, and now we're going to complete the pawn structure, having this very much like in the London system, like a little pyramid. And maybe the opponent will move knight to here, maybe they will move the other knight to f3. And again, we want to prepare c5 pawn break. So we can actually bring the queen to b6, a very common idea again in Caro Kann, aiming at c5. You can also prepare a c5 right away too. Now there is this queen move that might look a little bit annoying because they're attacking on b7. If they play that, we can go for a queen exchange. And as black, we're pretty happy. There's nothing really that concerns us in this position. So if we play c5, maybe they will play c3. Again, we can go for the pawn exchange, but there's no reason right away to capture that. If they capture us, we will capture back with the bishop, which is going to be a very, very good idea. So if they do that, you can bring out the knight and you can bring out the queen. We'll continue normally. Let's say they castle. Let's say we bring out the queen. They bring out the knight. Now, because of this pawn, we cannot move knight to f6. So we're going to maneuver the knight to f5, just like in the French defense. This is actually very, very similar in pawn structure-wise. We also played c5 too. But the huge benefit of doing it from the Caro Kann position is that we don't have that light squared bishop anymore, so we don't have that problem. Now we can move the knight to e7, and we're aiming at f5. Again, if they capture us now, because the bishop is blocked, we will have to capture back with the queen. Let's say they bring the rook instead. We can bring the knight, and we're aiming at this d4 pawn. And in the future, we can bring out the bishop to e7, rook to c8. Again, control this. Soon to be opening up c file, and we can castle over the king side. So this is the main ideas in the advanced variation. If they push the pawn, you right away bring out the bishop to f5, and we want to complete the pawn structure with e6. But there is actually a little trick that white can try to do. They can play h4 in this position. Now, if they play h4, we don't want to copy and play without thinking. e6 is not a good move because they can trap our bishop with these moves. Since they didn't move any knights, when they play g4, the queen is going to be defending it, so this will cost us a bishop. Now, if they play h4, we can play h6 or h5. But h6 is a little bit passive because they can still kick our bishop away, and white is gaining so much space over the king side. So to combat that, instead of going to h6 this time, we can go to h5. And after that, again, we have no problems. If they bring out the bishop, we can continue normally, we can capture. And especially in this position, we don't want to move the bishop back, or we don't want to defend this bishop with the pawn, because then we get this very weird looking pawn structure, a lot of weaknesses that can be created, and white can use it. So if they bring out the bishop, again, you're going to capture them, they will capture back with the queen. We complete the pawn structure, aiming to push c5 again, and we can do the regular ideas afterwards. Queen to b6, knight to c6, and the game will continue that way. Alright, so this was this is the advanced variation. Now, the most not basic, but the most intuitive, natural idea is what happens if white captures our pawn. If they capture, we capture back with the pawn, and they generally bring out their bishop to d3 to cut our bishop from going to f5. So we won't be able to move the bishop out yet. And because we can't move the bishop out yet, neither to f5 or g4, we're not going to push the pawn yet. We're going to wait. So what are we going to wait for? Well, we're waiting for the opponent's knight to go to f3 so that we can bring our bishop to g4. And then we will be pinning the knight too. So if they bring out the bishop to here, we can do a normal development move. If they bring the bishop to d3, they might also move their pawn to c3 instead of moving the knight here. And again, we're going to move the knight. If they bring out their knight, we can bring our bishop to g4. Now our bishop is out and safe, so we can prepare e6. So if they castle, we can play e6. Since the opponent has a nice pawn chain over there, we cannot really move our bishop to these squares. So instead, we're going to aim for the d6 square. And because our c-file is open, you can try to do a minority attack over the queen side, but we can also try to bring the queen to c7 and do some attacks over the opponent's castled king. So maybe they will move out the bishop here to stop us. Again, we can bring our bishop here without any problems. If they take, we take. If they make a mistake, you can just take it. If they bring the queen, like they want to bring out the queen, but you can actually capture the knight because the king will be opened after the pawn is going to capture our bishop. If they go back, you can castle. The game will continue normally. So again, because our c-file is half open, we can bring the rook to c8 too. Again, if they capture, we want to capture back. Now, if they move the knight to c3, we can play normally. Developing the knight, they're attacking our pawn. We're developing our knight. And if they bring their knight to here, we can bring our bishop to f5 or g4 to get the bishop out. And if they move out their bishop now, we just play normally again. So knight will go to c6, rook will go to c8, bishop can go to d6. Because they didn't do this pawn chain, there's a knight here instead. You can also consider moving the bishop to b4 too. And then we can try to maybe win a pawn over there if the rook is on c8, putting pressure over here. But because they will castle kingside quickly, we don't usually get an advantage from that pin. So again, bishop d6 is a very normal move. And the game will continue like this. Now, if the opponent plays something a little bit different, like the fantasy variation, which is f3, there's so many different ideas that you can do. You can play queen b6, You can play pawn e6. But we don't want to play pawn e6 right away because, again, the bishop is going to be a little bit back. But that is still a very, very safe option. So if they play f3, guys, the idea is that they want to control the full center. But we can actually capture this pawn and attack white's perfect center. So in order to attack this center, we're going to do this pawn sacrifice with e5. Now, it looks like a free pawn, but it's actually a very, very bad idea for the opponent to take it because first, they have double isolated pawns in the center, so these are very easy targets to try to attack. And second, we can go for a very much like a wayward queen attack. Doing a check, attacking this pawn, and if they play g3, you can be very happy. You just want the opponent's rook. If they move the king to somewhere, again, we can capture this pawn using the opponent's weakness, and you can try to like put more pressure on the opponent's king, and black is going to be very comfortable in this position. Now, white can try to recover from this, but it's going to take them a long time because the bishop is also blocked by the king, so they won't be able to do that development move, but the game will continue in black's favor. But what happens if they don't take the pawn? Well, they can actually move the knight out to attack this pawn. So they actually want to capture this pawn right now. But again, if they capture with this, the queen can go here. So there are some other ideas that they can try to do. Now, if they bring out the knight, we're going to move the bishop to g4 to first get the bishop into the game, and second, we're going to pin the opponent's knight. So we are actually defending the pawn this way. So this is something to keep in mind. Now, if that happens, maybe the opponent will move out the bishop to here, putting pressure on our f7 pawn. Even though it might look like a good idea to capture the opponent's pawn, we definitely don't want to do that. Like, you might think that we can remove the defender by capturing the knight, and then we can win this pawn, but there's all sorts of attacks that the opponent's queen can do. And because they don't have the f-file pawn anymore, they can also castle, use the rook on that file too. So if the opponent's bishop comes to here, we're going to defend the pawn with the knight. We're going to bring the knight into the game, developing the knight, and we're also supporting this. Now, the most interesting move for white to do is c3. If they like castle, you can play normal, you can develop your pieces. But if they play c3, they're actually preparing a very sneaky attack. Since we moved our bishop, our b7 pawn is hanging. And because their bishop is on c4, they're also aiming at our f7 pawn. So they're preparing queen b3 to attack b7 and f7. And in order to counter that, we're going to move the bishop to h5. We're losing a tempo by moving the bishop again, but there's also a very good option for the bishop. Now they won't be able to attack us with tempo, not right away, and bishop is defending f7. If they do bring the queen to b3, we can counter this with b5, and opponent's bishop will have to go back. And as black, we're actually pretty comfortable right now. But yeah, not too many people play the fantasy variation, but this is how you counter white's plan. And those are mainly like the main ideas that can happen in Caro Kann. If there are any questions, any comments, feel free to leave it below. We have a chess.com club page you guys can join. Every Friday we have an arena. And if you guys liked this video, please subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.